Welcome to Rebooking, the series where I look at horribly booked WWE storylines and wrestlers and make up a scenario about how I would do them. Today, we will be talking about how I would have booked WWE in 2020. WWE in 2020 has been both great as well as horrible for storylines. SmackDown has consistently given us great storylines, such as Roman vs. Jay, or Bayley and Sasha. But however, Raw gave us 73 total matches of Randy Orton vs. Drew McIntyre, and Lana vs. Announcer's Table. Let's see how I would book this year. As the last video of 2020, I will be talking about how I would book the top WWE World Championships, similar to my WWE in 2021 video. This includes the Raw and SmackDown's Women's Championship, Universal Championship and the WWE Championship. The current champions at the beginning of 2020 are The Fiend as Universal Champion, Bayley as SmackDown Champion, Becky Lynch as Raw Champion, and Brock Lesnar as WWE Champion. We start at Royal Rumble in January, and end at TLC in December. Alright, let's begin. So, at Royal Rumble, we have exactly the same matches. Brock Lesnar enters the Men's Rumble, Lynch vs. ASUKA for the Raw Women's Championship, Bayley vs. Evans for the SmackDown Women's Championship, and The Fiend vs. BRYAN for the Universal Championship. We also have the Women's Royal Rumble. All the results are same as real life, as Lynch, Bayley and Fiend all retain their titles. Drew McIntyre wins the Men's Rumble match. However, instead of Charlotte, SHAYNA BASZLER wins the Women's Royal Rumble. This leads to Super Showdown. Again, I am keeping every match same. Bayley vs. Naomi for SmackDown Women's Championship, Brock Lesnar vs. Ricochet for the WWE Championship, and The Fiend vs. Goldberg for the Universal Championship. Bayley retains. Similar to IRL, it is important to mention that here, Bayley turns on Sasha because she mistakenly almost cost Bayley the match. However, the other two matches change a bit. Ricochet gets a bit more offense against Lesnar after he attacks Lesnar's shoulder, but after a 10-minute match, two F5s finish the match. Goldberg vs. Fiend, however, is a squash match in favor of The Fiend. Wyatt completely dominates Goldberg, and retains his championship under 2 minutes. Elimination Chamber is a little different. First of all, we are gonna have a men's Elimination Chamber match. There, we find Shinsuke Nakamura, Cesaro, AJ Styles, Daniel Bryan, Andrade, and Aleister Black. The Women's Chamber match will consist of Sarah Logan, Ruby Riott, Natalya, Liv Morgan, Asuka and Sasha Banks. The championships will not be defended that day. We see that Black and Sasha win their respective chamber matches. Finally we come to WrestleMania 36. Also, Fiend vacates the championship as The Fiend wanted to face Cena at WrestleMania, but the championship had to be defended against Black. So, we have the Firefly Funhouse match, and there is a tournament held throughout the weeks that will determine who would have faced Reigns at WrestleMania. This tournament is won by Roman Reigns. This would have led to Reigns vs. Black, but like real life, Roman pulls out of his match due to the pandemic. So, Aleister Black faces substitution Braun Strowman. Other than that, Bayley faces Sasha Banks for the SmackDown Women's Championship in a 2 out of 3 falls match. Becky Lynch defends her title against Shayna Baszler. And finally Drew McIntyre vs. Brock Lesnar for the WWE Championship. Here are the results. Baszler becomes the new Raw Women's Champion after making Becky tap out. Sasha wins the SmackDown Women's Championship. McIntyre becomes the new WWE Championship, and Aleister Black becomes the new Universal Champion. After WrestleMania, the next pay-per-view is Money in the Bank. Here, all the championships will be defended, as well as 2 Money in the Bank matches. Sasha Banks and Bayley have a rematch for the SmackDown Women's Championship. Drew McIntyre faces Seth Rollins for the WWE Championship. Aleister Black vs. The Miz for the Universal Championship, and SHAYNA BASZLER vs ASUKA with the Raw Women's Championship on the line. Initially, the idea would have been Becky vs BASZLER vs ASUKA, but due to Lynch's pregnancy, she would be pulled out of the match. All champions successfully defend their championship, and Charlotte and Sami Zayn win the Money in the Bank briefcases. Next up is Backlash. Here, Sasha defends her SmackDown Championship against Lacey Evans. Drew McIntyre puts his WWE Championship against Andrade. Aleister Black vs Sheamus for the Universal Championship, and Shayna Baszler vs Nia Jax for the Raw Women's Championship. Again, all champions successfully defend their championship. After this comes the horror show, Extreme Rules. Here, a bunch of interesting matches take place. First, Drew McIntyre vs Randy Orton for the WWE Championship, Shayna Baszler vs Asuka for the Raw Women's Championship, Sasha Banks vs Dana Brooke for the SmackDown Women's Championship, and finally, Aleister Black vs John Morrison for the Universal Championship. The results are as follows: McIntyre retains his championship, Baszler retains her championship, Black retains his championship, and Sasha wins her match against Dana, but Charlotte cashes in to win the SmackDown Women's Championship. This leads to the biggest party of the summer, Summerslam. A lot of big matches take place here, as Shayna Baszler defends her Raw Women's Championship against recently called up RHEA Ripley, Sasha Banks vs Bayley vs Charlotte Flair for the SmackDown Women's Championship, Drew McIntyre against recently called up Keith Lee for the WWE Championship, and Aleister Black puts his WWE Championship on the line against The Fiend. The results are: RHEA becomes the new Raw Women's Champion, Charlotte retains her SmackDown Women's Championship, The Fiend defeats Black for the Universal Championship, after which Roman returns similar to real life and beats them both up, and McIntyre retains his title, but Lee has a great showing. A week later, Payback takes place. Here, Bayley and Sasha have a #1 contenders match for the SmackDown Women's title, which Sasha wins. Other than that, Baszler gets her rematch against Ripley, which ends in a double countout. McIntyre faces Lashley for the WWE Championship, which McIntyre retains, and Black, Wyatt and Reigns have a triple threat match for the Universal Championship, which of course Reigns wins. P.S. From here on forward, I will be booking the Universal Championship picture exactly the same, since it is an almost perfect booking. I would have had the draft right after this. The important changes to note here are Nakamura and Cesaro move over to Raw, while Owens moves over to SmackDown. At Clash of Champions, we have Drew McIntyre vs Dolph Ziggler for the WWE Championship, Roman Reigns vs Jey Uso for the Universal Championship, Charlotte vs Sasha Banks for the SmackDown Championship, and Rhea Ripley vs Shayna Baszler for the Raw Women's Championship in a no disqualification match. As of the results, McIntyre retains, Roman retains, Charlotte retains, and finally, Shayna wins her match against Ripley to become a two-time Raw Women's Champion. This leads to Hell in a Cell, where Rhea Ripley gets her rematch against Shayna Baszler for the Raw Women's Championship in the Hell in a Cell. McIntyre vs Nakamura for the WWE Championship, Charlotte Flair vs Bianca Belair for the SmackDown Women's Championship, and finally, Roman Reigns vs Jey Uso in a Hell in a Cell match for the Universal Championship. The results are: Nakamura wins the WWE Championship, Reigns retains his championship, Belair wins the SmackDown Women's Championship, and Ripley wins back her Raw Women's Championship. Survivor Series brings the Brand Warfare season around, where we see Nakamura vs Reigns, and Belair vs Rhea Ripley. Both the SmackDown superstars, that is Reigns and Belair, win their respective matches, as Baszler distracts Ripley during the match. The last month we will be talking about is December, and hence the pay-per-view is TLC. Here, Roman Reigns faces Kevin Owens in a TLC match for the Universal Championship. Rhea Ripley vs Shayna Baszler in a TLC match. Nakamura vs McIntyre in a WWE Championship match in a tables match. And finally Bianca Belair vs Charlotte Flair in a chairs match or the SmackDown Women's Championship. To cap off the year, every champion retain their championship. But Sami Zayn cashes in his Money in the Bank contract to win the WWE Championship. Like the WWE in 2021 video, I think this booking would be incomplete without talking about how this would impact the corresponding WrestleMania. So, at WrestleMania 37, we will have these matches. 1. Bianca Belair vs Elimination Chamber winner Shayna Baszler for the SmackDown Women's Championship. 2. Roman Reigns vs Elimination Chamber winner Big E for the Universal Championship. 3. Rhea Ripley vs Royal Rumble winner Charlotte Flair for the Raw Women's Championship. And 4. Shinsuke Nakamura vs Sami Zayn vs Royal Rumble winner Cesaro for the WWE Championship. WrestleMania ends with Cesaro and Big E as new champions, while Ripley and Belair retain their titles. And that is it. That is how I would have booked WWE in 2020. Let me know if you enjoyed it and what to rebook next in the comment section below. Be sure to like, share and subscribe, that will help out the channel a lot. Thanks again, see you in the next one.